My husband, the CEO, looked down at me from the head of the table and announced he wanted a prenup. He said he was not going to risk his financial future on someone like me. I simply nodded, told him it was smart thinking, and had my lawyer add one tiny clause to protect everything I had secretly built. His legal team almost had a stroke when they finally realized my net worth was 50 times larger than his entire company. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old, and I am about to tell you exactly how I legally dismantled a narcissist. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through disrespect while secretly holding all the power. Trust me, you do not want to miss how this plays out. The ocean breeze was blowing gently off the Atlantic, but the atmosphere on the terrace of our rented Hamptons estate was completely suffocating. It was our official engagement dinner, a catered affair with imported orchids, vintage champagne, and a guest list that read like a directory of New York tech executives. Harrison, my supposed future husband, was standing at the head of the long dining table holding a crystal flute. At 35 years old, he was the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing software startup. He had the sharp suits, the practiced smile, and an ego that required constant feeding. Sitting directly to my right was his mother, Beatrice. She was 62 years old, dressed in stiff designer clothes, and wearing an expression that suggested someone had placed a piece of rotten fruit on her plate. From the moment Harrison and I started dating, Beatrice made it incredibly clear that a boutique financial advisor from a middle-class neighborhood was not fit to join her old money family. She spent the entire appetizer course loudly asking one of the board members if they knew any good divorce lawyers, simply as a joke, of course. Harrison tapped his spoon against his glass. The low hum of conversation faded as the 30 guests turned their attention to him. I expected the usual rehearsed speech about love and partnership. Instead, Harrison reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick bound document, and tossed it directly onto my dinner plate. The heavy stack of papers landed with a dull thud right on top of my meal. It was a 50-page prenuptial agreement. A heavy silence fell over the terrace. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Beatrice, however, took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine and smirked. Harrison looked down at me, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Sign it, Natalie," he commanded, his tone echoing across the patio. My company is weeks away from a massive merger. The board needs absolute certainty that my assets are protected. I cannot risk my equity and my future on someone whose entire career consists of crunching numbers for small-time clients. You have to understand, this is just business. I felt the eyes of every single person at that table burning into me. They were waiting for a reaction. They expected tears, a dramatic exit, or a desperate plea for him to reconsider. Beatrice leaned over and patted my hand with a cold, condescending grip. "Do not take it personally, dear," Beatrice purred loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Harrison has worked far too hard to build his empire. You cannot expect a man of his stature to just hand over half of everything he owns if things go sour. You should be grateful he is willing to provide for you at all. Just sign the paperwork, and we can all get back to celebrating." Harrison stood there, his chin raised, waiting for my compliance. He truly believed he had me completely cornered. He thought isolating me in front of his investors and his sneering mother would force me into panicked submission. He thought my small consulting firm was just a cute little hobby, keeping me busy while I waited to become his trophy wife. He assumed my silence was shock. He assumed my stillness was fear. He did not know that for the past decade I had been navigating boardrooms filled with men 10 times smarter and 100 times more ruthless than him. He did not know that I enjoyed being underestimated. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the pages of the legal trap he had just laid out for himself. Everyone held their breath, waiting for my fragile heart to break. They were completely blind to the reality of the situation. I was not a victim caught in a snare. I was the architect of the environment they were standing in. I let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, letting Harrison soak in what he thought was his ultimate victory. I looked at the thick document sitting on my plate. I looked at the smug satisfaction on Harrison's face and the mocking pity in Beatrice's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. Instead, I calmly wiped my hands with the linen napkin, reached into my designer bag, and pulled out my solid gold Mont Blanc pen. The heavy gold pen gleamed under the patio lights. Across the table, Harrison's sister Caroline leaned forward. She was 31 years old, wearing a silk dress paid for by her brother and a smug expression that perfectly mirrored their mother. Caroline rested her chin on her hand and sighed dramatically. "Honestly, Natalie, you should be thanking him," Caroline said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. Most men in Harrison's position would demand a complete background check before letting someone from a public state university marry into the family. At least with this contract, you get a generous monthly allowance if things go south. It is more than you could ever make at that little consulting office of yours. Beatrice chuckled, tapping her manicured nails against her wineglass. "Exactly, Caroline," Beatrice added. "It is a safety net for everyone. We protect our legacy, and Natalie gets a taste of how the upper class handles their affairs. No offense, dear, but people from your background simply do not understand the complexities of generational wealth. I let them talk. I let them paint their picture of the poor, helpless working-class girl being rescued by the wealthy tech prince. I did not bother looking at the first 49 pages of the document. I knew exactly what was in there. Standard boilerplate clauses designed to strip a spouse of all voting rights, equity, and marital property. Harrison had probably paid his overpriced lawyers a fortune to draft a document that essentially rendered me a temporary employee in his life. I flipped directly to the final page where the signature lines waited. I set the document down and picked up my phone. Under the table, hidden from their gloating eyes, I quickly typed a message to the senior partner of my actual legal team. The team that handled my 9-figure acquisitions. The message was simple. Send over the blind trust addendum immediately. Within 30 seconds, my phone buzzed. My lawyer had emailed a single paragraph to Harrison lead counsel, who was sitting at the far end of our dinner table. The older lawyer phone chimed. He glanced at the screen, frowned, and then looked down the table at me. Harrison noticed the exchange. "What is it?" Harrison barked, annoyed that his perfect moment of domination was being interrupted. "It appears your fiancée legal counsel has requested one minor addition before she signs the document." His lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "A single sentence to be added to the property division clause." "Unbelievable," Harrison muttered, rolling his eyes loudly. "What is it?" "A demand to keep the engagement ring. A request for a larger severance package." "Read it." "The clause states total waiver of rights to any assets derived from the blind trusts of either party." The lawyer read straight from his screen. Harrison stared blankly for a second before bursting into laughter. "A blind trust," he mocked, shaking his head. "You have a blind trust, Natalie. What is in it?" "The profits from your little neighborhood bake sales, the lease to your rented sedan." He looked around the table, inviting his board members to join in the joke. A few of them chuckled nervously. Caroline covered her mouth, trying to hide a massive grin. Sitting quietly next to Caroline was her husband, Derek. He was a brilliant forensic accountant and the only person in this family with genuine common sense. He did not laugh when Harrison mocked me. Derek watched me closely, his dark eyes analyzing my calm demeanor. He noticed the expensive pen. He noticed the lack of hesitation. Derek knew the difference between a panicked victim and a predator waiting to strike, but he kept his mouth shut. "It is just a standard precaution," I said, my voice perfectly level. "You want to protect your company. I want to protect what is mine. If neither of us has any hidden millions, we have nothing to worry about." "Are you going to let one silly sentence hold up your ironclad contract?" Harrison scoffed, completely blinded by his own arrogance. He thought my request was a pathetic attempt to save face in front of his wealthy friends. He thought I was playing pretend, dressing up as a serious businesswoman. "Fine," he snapped, waving his hand dismissively at his lawyer. "Add the pointless clause. Let her keep her imaginary trust fund. I do not care. Just print the final signature page so we can end this circus and eat our dinner." His lawyer rushed inside the house to print the revised page. 5 minutes later, the crisp white sheet of paper was placed in front of me. I did not hesitate. I uncapped my pen, and signed my name in fluid, deliberate strokes. I slid the paper across the table to Harrison. He grabbed a cheap plastic pen from his pocket and scribbled his name without even glancing at the newly added text. He pushed the document back to his lawyer, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. Beatrice raised her glass in a triumphant toast, and Caroline went back to checking her makeup in the reflection of her butter knife. "See?" Harrison said, smiling at me with a cold, calculated grin. "That was not so hard. Now we can have a perfect marriage." I smiled back. A genuine, warm smile. I looked down at the freshly signed contract. The ink was drying rapidly. Harrison had just legally walled himself off from my entire financial empire. He had just signed away his right to $500 million. The trap was set, and he had locked the cage from the inside. 1 week later, the wedding was over, and Harrison was sitting on top of the world. The ceremony had been exactly what you would expect from a man obsessed with his own image. A lavish, over-the-top spectacle designed to show his investors that he was a stable, successful leader. During the reception, he had paraded me around like a well-behaved pet. He introduced me to his wealthy friends as his sweet little wife, who liked to play with spreadsheets. He genuinely believed that the prenuptial agreement safely locked me away in a corner of his life. He thought he had complete control. He was completely wrong. It was a Tuesday morning. Harrison was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table inside a glass-walled conference room in Midtown Manhattan. This was the final due diligence meeting for his highly anticipated corporate merger. His software startup was being acquired by a massive holding company, and the deal was expected to close at over $300 million. Harrison was in his element. He was wearing a bespoke suit pointing at projection screens and talking endlessly about user acquisition metrics and projected revenue streams. He was practically vibrating with the thrill of his own perceived genius. Outside the glass walls, the frantic energy of his corporate headquarters buzzed along. But inside the room, Harrison commanded absolute attention. He was just about to hand over the final stack of financial disclosures to the executives of the acquiring firm when the heavy glass door clicked open. It was his lead counsel, the same smug older lawyer who had printed out my blind trust clause at the engagement dinner. Only this time he was not smiling. His face was the color of wet ash. He was sweating profusely through his expensive dress shirt, and his hands were trembling as he clutched a thick red tabbed dossier. He ignored the acquiring executives completely. He walked straight up to Harrison, grabbed him by the elbow, and whispered something in his ear. Harrison yanked his arm away, looking profoundly annoyed. He hated being interrupted when he was holding court. He forced a tight smile for the executives, apologized for the brief delay, and stepped out into the hallway with his lawyer. I know exactly what happened in that hallway because Harrison owned security cameras, recorded the entire exchange, and my team later obtained the footage. "What is wrong with you?" Harrison hissed, dragging the lawyer into a soundproof alcove. "You are making me look incompetent in front of the buyers. We are hours away from finalizing the SEC filings. What could possibly be so urgent?" The lawyer could barely catch his breath. He opened the red dossier and shoved it into Harrison's chest. "It is your wife," he stammered. The SEC compliance team for the acquiring firm mandated a deep-dive background check on all immediate family members, standard procedure to ensure there are no hidden liabilities or conflicts of interest. "We ran the audit on Natalie." Harrison rolled his eyes. "I told you she is nobody. She runs a tiny boutique financial advisory firm out of a rented office." "What did she do?" "Miss a tax payment on her leased car. Pay off whatever fine she owes and get back in that room so we can finish this deal." The lawyer grabbed Harrison by the shoulders, shaking him slightly. "You are not listening to me," he said, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "That boutique firm is not a real business. It is a front. It is a corporate shell designed to manage her personal logistics and hide her identity from the public market. We had to dig through 4 layers of offshore holding companies to find the actual entity she controls." Harrison frowned, the first hint of genuine confusion breaking through his arrogance. "What are you talking about? What entity?" The lawyer's hands shook as he flipped to the second page of the dossier, pointing at a heavily redacted financial chart. Natalie does not manage small business portfolios, Harrison. She is the sole anonymous founder and majority stakeholder of a massive private equity fund, one of the most aggressive funds on the eastern seaboard. Harrison stared at the paper. His brain could not process the words. "That is impossible," he whispered. The lawyer swallowed hard, sweat dripping down his temples. "That is not all," he said. "Remember that blind trust clause she made you sign at the dinner, the one you laughed at, the one where you legally waived all rights to her hidden assets. That blind trust holds her personal equity. Harrison, she does not have $50,000. Her trust controls over $400 million. She is a titan, and you just signed away every right you had to her money." Harrison stood completely frozen in the carpeted hallway. He stared at the sweating lawyer, refusing to comprehend the words that had just left the man's mouth. It was a physical impossibility. Natalie was the woman who meticulously checked the bills for their shared apartment. She was the woman who drove a modest car and wore unbranded sweaters. He snatched the thick red dossier out of the lawyer's trembling hands and slammed it open against the hallway wall. "Look at the organizational chart," the lawyer urged, pointing a shaking finger at a complex web of corporate structures printed on the heavy paper. "Look at the flow of capital, Harrison." Harrison's eyes darted across the page. He saw a maze of Delaware limited liability companies, offshore accounts, and blind trusts. It was a masterpiece of corporate obfuscation. All the arrows, all the holding companies funneled upward, converging into one apex entity. It was a notoriously aggressive private equity firm based in Lower Manhattan, known for gutting underperforming companies and swallowing competitors whole. Harrison knew the firm by reputation. Every tech founder in the city lived in fear of their hostile takeovers. Right at the top of the pyramid, sitting above the board of directors and the managing partners, was a single black box labeled Sole Proprietor. Next to that box was the name of his sweet, quiet wife. "This has to be a mistake," Harrison muttered, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "This is a clerical error. You pulled the wrong background check. There is another Natalie in the database." "There is no mistake," the lawyer replied, his tone grim and absolute. "We cross-referenced her social security number, her tax returns, and the routing numbers from that boutique firm she runs. That tiny office is not a business, Harrison. It is a family office. It is a private command center she uses to manage her personal logistics while remaining completely invisible to the public market. She structured it so perfectly that neither you nor I nor anyone in your orbit had any idea who she really was." Harrison felt a cold sweat break out across the back of his neck. He looked back down at the numbers. The total assets under management were staggering. The net worth tied directly to her personal trust was verified at over $400 million. His brain began to short-circuit. His entire identity was built on being the wealthy provider, the tech genius who was elevating a mediocre woman into high society. He had spent the last 2 years treating her like a subordinate. He had let his mother insult her background. He had let his sister mock her career. All the while she was sitting on a mountain of capital that made his highly anticipated startup merger look like pocket change. And then the memory hit him. The Hamptons' engagement dinner. The ocean breeze, the mocking laughter of his family. Harrison's breath hitched. The prenup, he gasped, his chest suddenly feeling incredibly tight. The lawyer nodded slowly, looking like a man delivering a death sentence. "The prenup. You paid us a fortune to draft the most ruthless ironclad agreement possible. You wanted zero loopholes. You wanted to make absolutely certain that she could never touch a single cent of your equity or your future earnings. But when she had us add that one tiny clause about the blind trust, she made the contract completely symmetrical." "I did not even read it," Harrison choked out, leaning heavily against the wall for support. "I just signed it to get the dinner over with." "By signing it, you legally walled yourself off from her entire empire," the lawyer explained, his voice laced with a mixture of awe and terror. "Because you insisted on total financial separation to protect yourself, you have zero marital claim to her estate. In the state of New York, that document is unbreakable. She used your own lawyers and your own arrogance to build an impenetrable fortress around her money. Harrison slowly turned his head to look through the glass walls of the conference room. The executives from the acquiring firm were sitting at the mahogany table checking their watches, waiting for him to return and finalize the paperwork. He had walked out of that room feeling like a king about to conquer the world. But standing here in the hallway holding the red dossier, the crushing reality of his situation crashed down on him. He was not the powerful CEO closing the deal of a lifetime. He was a fool who had just been outplayed by a grandmaster. He looked down at his right hand. The hand that had so carelessly scribbled his signature with a cheap plastic pen while she used her solid gold Mont Blanc. His pulse hammered in his ears as the absolute magnitude of his mistake took hold. In his desperate, arrogant attempt to protect his startup from his wife, Harrison realized he had just legally, permanently, and irreversibly signed away his right to $500 million. Harrison abandoned the acquiring executives at the mahogany table. He ignored his frantic lead counsel and the bewildered stares of his own employees sprinting toward the elevator. Ripping off his tailored jacket, he ran out of the building and flagged down a taxi. His mind raced, replaying the disastrous engagement dinner over and over. He had to reach the penthouse immediately to find the physical documents. When the elevator doors opened into our luxury apartment, Harrison burst through the entryway like a man possessed. I was sitting on the velvet sofa in the living room wearing my usual comfortable sweater, reading a quarterly earnings report on my tablet. A fresh cup of black coffee was steaming on the glass table in front of me. Ignoring my presence completely, he charged straight into his home office. I heard drawers being yanked open and slammed shut. Books were swept off shelves, followed by the heavy thud of his leather briefcase being upended onto the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily and cursing under his breath, while frantically tearing through his locked filing cabinets. Finally, he stormed back into the living room, clutching a thick stack of papers. It was the physical copy of our prenuptial agreement. It was the exact same document he had so proudly tossed onto my dinner plate just a few weeks prior. His face was flushed deep red, and his eyes were wild with unfiltered panic. Without saying a word, he grabbed the heavy document with both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. He tore the thick parchment paper again and again, until his hands were physically shaking and the floor was covered in jagged white shreds. He kicked the pile of torn paper aggressively, dispersing the pieces across the expensive Persian rug. He stood there with his chest heaving, looking at me as if he had just slain a mighty dragon. "Natalie," he said, his voice trembling with a forced and desperate affection. "What are we doing? This is utter madness. I have been thinking all morning, and I realize just how incredibly foolish I have been." I slowly lowered my tablet and took a calculated sip of my black coffee. I did not say a word. I just sat back and let him dig his own grave. "We are husband and wife, Natalie." He took a step closer, holding his hands out in a grand gesture of fake surrender. "Marriage is not a cold business transaction. It is about true love. It is about partnership. When we stood at the altar, we promised to share our lives together completely. How can we truly be united if we have these massive walls built up between our finances?" I was entirely wrong to ever suggest a prenup. It sends the wrong message. It says I do not trust you, and nothing could be further from the truth. I trust you with my life, darling. I want us to build our future as equals, sharing absolutely everything we have. It was honestly a remarkably impressive performance. If I did not already know that his lawyer had just exposed my private equity fund an hour ago, I might have actually believed the raw emotion in his voice. He was practically begging me to forget the boundaries he had so aggressively enforced when he firmly believed I was poor. He wanted to be equals only now that my verified net worth vastly dwarfed his entire existence. I set my coffee cup down on the glass table. The sharp clink of the porcelain echoed loudly in the quiet penthouse. "Harrison," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "Why are you sweating?" He froze, his hands dropping awkwardly to his sides. "I am not sweating. I just rushed home because I had this massive epiphany. I want to tear down the walls between us. Look, I destroyed the contract. It is gone forever. We can start fresh today. I looked down at the shredded pieces of paper littering the rug. You did a great job tearing up your personal copy, Harrison. But my legal team filed the digital copies with the state of New York 3 days ago. The document is fully notarized, legally processed, and permanently binding. Tearing up a piece of paper in our living room does not change the law. The blood instantly drained from his face. The loving, supportive husband facade vanished, replaced by venomous rage. You planned this, he hissed, pointing a shaking finger. You set me up and tricked me. You demanded the prenup, Harrison, I reminded him. I just added one sentence. His hands balled into fists. I will not let you walk away with everything, he shouted. I will drag you through the courts. I will sue you for fraud. I will have that prenup nullified and take half of every dollar you have. I watched Harrison storm out of the penthouse, his hollow threats echoing off the marble walls. Suing me would require money and competent lawyers, neither of which he would soon have. But he was not the only one who had discovered the truth. News of my actual net worth had apparently traveled fast through the family grapevine. Harrison must have immediately run crying to his mother, because by the very next morning, my private sanctuary was breached. I was sitting in my actual office. Not the small boutique suite I used as a front, but my sleek glass-enclosed command center overlooking Wall Street. My assistant buzzed my intercom. She sounded incredibly confused, stating that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law were in the reception area demanding entry. They were claiming they had an urgent family emergency. I smiled a cold, calculated smile and told her to send them right in. Beatrice and Caroline swept into the room like they owned the building. Gone were the sneers and the condescending glares that had defined our entire relationship. Beatrice wore a warm, overly practiced smile carrying a box of expensive imported pastries. Caroline practically ran over to my desk, attempting to pull me into a tight, affectionate hug. I remained seated, keeping my hands perfectly still over my keyboard, forcing Caroline to awkwardly pat my shoulder instead. Natalie, darling. Beatrice cooed, looking around the opulent office with wide, greedy eyes. The panoramic views of the city skyline clearly validated everything Harrison had told them. We had absolutely no idea you were running such a magnificent operation. Harrison told us everything last night. We are just so incredibly proud of you. Caroline chimed in, nodding vigorously, her designer jewelry clinking together. So proud, Natalie. You are exactly the kind of strong, successful woman this family needs. We always knew you were special. They sat down in the leather guest chairs without being asked. Beatrice immediately launched into her rehearsed pitch. She talked at length about how family must always support each other. She used words like unity and legacy, explaining how wealth is a blessing meant to be shared. Caroline did not waste any time pulling a thick designer folder from her handbag. Actually, Natalie, since we are truly family now, I was hoping you could help me out of a tiny bind, Caroline said, batting her eyelashes. Derek is being so unreasonable about my spending lately. I just have a few credit card balances that need clearing. It is barely $200,000. Honestly, it is pocket change for someone in your position. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of Caroline's request, Beatrice leaned forward, resting her heavily ringed hand on my desk. And speaking of family, we really need a proper place to gather for the upcoming holidays. There is a gorgeous historic summer home currently available in Nantucket. It is only $4 million. I think it would be a beautiful gesture for you to purchase it in my name, of course, as a foundation for our family legacy. I looked back and forth between the two of them. Less than a month ago, Beatrice had publicly humiliated me, suggesting I needed an allowance. Caroline had mocked my public university education. Now they were sitting in my command center, treating me like their personal automated teller machine. Let me make sure I fully understand this, I said, my voice dropping to a freezing temperature. You want me to pay off Caroline massive shopping debts and buy you a vacation mansion in Nantucket because it is my duty as family. Exactly, Beatrice beamed, entirely oblivious to the lethal danger in my tone. We are all one big happy family now. We share our blessings. I stood up slowly from my chair, leaning my palms against the cool glass of my desk. Beatrice, do you remember the engagement dinner? Do you remember telling the entire table that people from my background do not understand generational wealth? Do you remember laughing when your son threw a 50-page legal contract on top of my dinner plate to ensure I would never touch a single dime of his money? The fake smiles instantly vanished from their faces. Caroline shifted nervously, looking down at her expensive folder. Natalie, that was just a misunderstanding, she stammered. We were just being protective of Harrison. You were being greedy, I corrected her sharply, my voice echoing in the large room. You demanded total financial separation. You got total financial separation. The blind trust clause you all thought was so hilarious applies to everyone in this room. My money belongs to me. You will not see a single cent of it to pay off your ridiculous credit cards, Caroline. And Beatrice, you will never step foot in a Nantucket home funded by my bank account. Beatrice stood up, her face flushing an ugly, angry red. Listen to me, you arrogant little girl, she spat. Dropping the sweet mother-in-law act entirely, you married into this family. You owe us the respect and the financial support that comes with our pristine name. If you do not write those checks today, I will make sure everyone in our New York social circle knows exactly how selfish and deceitful you really are. I did not blink. I reached across my desk and pressed the silver button on my intercom console. Security, I said clearly into the speaker. I have 2 unauthorized visitors in my private suite. Please escort them out of the building immediately. If they refuse to walk out quietly, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. Beatrice gasped, clutching her pearls in genuine shock. Caroline looked completely panicked, frantically gathering her purse and her folder. You cannot do this to us, Natalie. Caroline whined, backing away toward the door. I just did, I replied, turning my back on them to look out the floor-to-ceiling window at the city below. The heavy oak doors of my office swung open, and 2 large security guards stepped inside. I did not bother turning around as Beatrice shrieked indignantly, throwing terrible insults while the guards physically ushered them out into the hallway. They came looking for a massive payday, but they left with nothing but complete public humiliation. I did not even watch them leave. I simply sat back down at my desk and returned to the quarterly projections flashing on my monitors. Beatrice and Caroline were not the first greedy people I had forcefully removed from my presence, and I highly doubted they would be the last. I knew Beatrice had threatened to ruin my reputation on her way out, but I severely underestimated the sheer speed and viciousness of an angry socialite with too much free time. It started less than 48 hours later. I was in the middle of a conference call with our European acquisitions team when my lead public relations director pinged my private secure channel. She sent me a link to a prominent New York society blog. The site was notorious for blending high society gossip with Wall Street rumors, making it a guilty pleasure for half the executives in the city. The headline blared across the screen in bold black letters: "The Secret Shell Game of a Tech CEO New Bride." I clicked the link and read the article while keeping my voice perfectly steady on my conference call. Beatrice and Caroline had gone straight to the tabloids, and they had completely fabricated a sensational narrative. They did not expose my private equity firm because, frankly, they did not understand the complex financial structures Harrison Lawyer had uncovered. Instead, they took the fact that my boutique advisory firm was a front and spun it into a massive criminal conspiracy. According to the anonymous sources quoted in the article, I was not a brilliant investor. I was a con artist. The blog claimed my small financial firm was a Ponzi scheme designed to launder money and swindle elderly clients out of their retirement funds. Caroline had apparently provided fake quotes, crying about how she had trusted her new sister-in-law, only to discover deep financial irregularities. The article painted me as a desperate fraudster who had trapped a brilliant tech founder into marriage to legitimize my dirty money. By noon, 3 other gossip sites had picked up the story. By the end of the day, it had migrated from the society pages to the minor financial blogs. My phone buzzed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. I opened it. It was a single line of text. The asking price for the Nantucket house just went up to $5 million, and Caroline credit cards need to be cleared by Friday, or the next round of stories will name your specific holding companies. It was pure textbook extortion. They genuinely believed they had me trapped in a public relations nightmare. They thought the threat of exposure would force me to open my checkbook and fund their luxurious lifestyles. What Beatrice and Caroline failed to realize was that I was entirely insulated. My name was buried under so many layers of corporate anonymity that no tabloid journalist could ever legally connect me to my private equity fund without risking a billion-dollar defamation lawsuit. The rumors were completely baseless and legally harmless to my actual empire. I simply forwarded the extortion text message to my legal team and instructed them to begin quietly drafting harassment and libel suits. I did not reply to Beatrice. I did not send a single dime. However, while the smear campaign was completely harmless to me, it was highly radioactive to someone else. Harrison's upcoming merger was the crown jewel of his entire existence. The acquiring company was a massive publicly traded holding firm with a notoriously strict compliance department and an incredibly risk-averse board of directors. They hated bad press. They despised unpredictability. And right now, the CEO they were about to hand $300 million to was splashed across the internet, married to an alleged scam artist. Harrison had built his entire brand on being a genius visionary. Now the blogs were painting him as either a gullible fool who got conned by his wife or a willing accomplice in her supposed financial crimes. Late that afternoon, my secure phone rang. It was not Beatrice. It was Harrison. "Natalie, you need to fix this right now," he yelled the second I answered. His voice was completely frantic, echoing with blind panic. "Fix what I asked," my tone deliberately bored. The articles, he screamed. The board members of the acquiring firm just called an emergency meeting. Their compliance team is losing their minds over these fraud allegations. They are threatening to put the entire acquisition on an indefinite hold. They said they cannot afford the optical risk of merging with my company while my wife is being investigated by internet journalists for money laundering. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out over the city. "Have you tried asking your mother and sister to stop feeding lies to the tabloids? They are furious with you." Harrison shot back, completely missing the point. "You humiliated them. You have all this money and you treated my family like garbage. Just pay them off, Natalie. Buy the stupid summer house and make them issue a retraction before they ruin my deal." I smiled. "No." "What do you mean, no?" Harrison gasped, his breath catching in his throat. "Natalie, if this merger falls through, my investors will pull out. My company will tank. The buyers just gave me 48 hours to clear your name, or they are walking away from the table completely. You have to pay them. You should have read the prenup, Harrison." I replied softly. "My money is strictly my own. Good luck with your emergency meeting." I hung up the phone. Beatrice and Caroline thought they were attacking me, but they had just lobbed a live grenade directly into Harrison boardroom. The trap was tightening, and they were doing all the work for me. That evening, Harrison demanded a mandatory family dinner at the penthouse. He claimed we needed to form a united front to handle the media crisis. In reality, he just wanted an audience while he tried to bully me into submission. The private chef had prepared a lavish meal, but the expensive food sat completely untouched on the dining table. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly toxic. Harrison was aggressively pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. He was sweating and running his hands through his hair. His voice echoed through the large room as he screamed at me to fix the public relations disaster. He said his investors were breathing down his neck and the acquiring holding company was threatening to audit his entire startup. He blamed me entirely. He yelled that my refusal to pay off his family had triggered this nightmare, and now his life work was crumbling. I sat quietly at the table, resting my hands in my lap. I watched his meltdown with complete indifference. Sitting across from me were Beatrice and Caroline. They were both putting on an award-winning performance of fake sympathy. Beatrice sighed loudly, shaking her head. She said it was an absolute tragedy that my dark financial secrets were destroying her brilliant son. Caroline chimed in, agreeing with her mother. She told Harrison that he was the real victim in all of this, and that I was clearly a liability to the family legacy. They were feeding his panic, hoping that the intense pressure would finally force me to write the extortion checks they had demanded. Sitting quietly next to Caroline was her husband Derek. As an African-American forensic accountant, Derek was no stranger to being underestimated by this family. Harrison had spent years making dismissive comments about Derek, referring to him as a simple number cruncher who could never understand the high-stakes world of tech startups. Beatrice and Caroline treated him more like an accessory than a human being. Derek always maintained a quiet, dignified composure in the face of their constant disrespect. He was highly observant, analytical, and fiercely intelligent. And tonight he had clearly reached his absolute limit. Harrison stopped pacing and slammed both of his fists onto the dining table right in front of me. He demanded that I immediately hire a crisis management firm and issue a public apology for my supposed corporate crimes. He told me I was going to lose everything if I did not listen to him. Before I could even respond, a heavy thud echoed sharply through the dining room. Everyone jumped and turned their heads. Derek had just dropped a massive, thick manila folder directly onto the center of the table. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up, adjusting his glasses. The room fell completely silent. Derek had never interrupted Harrison before. "Sit down, Harrison." Derek said, his voice low and commanding. His tone possessed an authority that instantly drained the anger right out of the room. Harrison blinked in sheer confusion. "Excuse me," Harrison scoffed, trying to regain his dominant posture. "This is my house and my company on the line, Derek. Keep out of this." Derek did not back down. Not back. He leaned forward and opened the heavy folder, spreading several printed spreadsheets and bank statements across the table. "I said sit down, Derek," repeated, his eyes locking onto Harrison with intense, unwavering focus. "You are making a fool of yourself and you are yelling at the wrong person." Beatrice clutched her napkin, her fake sympathetic smile faltering. "Derek, please," she warned softly. "Do not interfere with family business." "This stopped being family business the moment my joint checking account was used to fund a criminal smear campaign," Derek replied coldly. Caroline instantly went pale. She looked down at the table, refusing to make eye contact with her husband. Derek turned his attention to the rest of the room. He explained that as a forensic accountant, he spent his entire career tracking hidden assets and tracing illicit funds. He said that when the articles first hit the internet, he noticed some massive unexplained withdrawals from his own bank accounts. He decided to do some digging. He pulled the server logs from the gossip blogs and traced the routing numbers used to pay the anonymous freelance writers. He picked up a highlighted bank statement and slid it across the table toward Harrison. "Look at the payment trails," Derek instructed calmly. The fake stories about Natalie did not come from an angry investor or a whistleblower. They were paid for and orchestrated entirely by your mother and your sister. Harrison stared at the highlighted paper, his mouth hanging open. He looked from the document to Beatrice and then to Caroline. The silence in the room was deafening, but Derek was not finished revealing the full extent of the truth. Harrison looked down at the bank routing numbers and the receipts from the freelance journalists. The reality washed over him in a cold wave. His own mother and sister had risked his entire career just to throw a temper tantrum over a summer house and some credit card bills. He turned slowly to face Beatrice. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You paid them," Harrison said, his voice dangerously low and trembling with rage. "You paid internet tabloids to write criminal hit pieces about my wife right before the biggest financial transaction of my entire life." Beatrice tried to reach out and touch his arm, but he violently stepped back. "We did it for you, Harrison," she pleaded, her voice shaking with manufactured tears. "She was hiding millions from you. She humiliated us in her office. We just wanted to apply a little pressure so she would share her wealth with the family like a good wife should. We thought if we threatened her reputation, she would just pay us to make it go away quietly. Caroline nodded frantically, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. We never thought it would affect your merger, Harrison. We were just trying to get what you deserve. Harrison let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. He ran his hands over his face, trying to process the sheer stupidity of his family. Then, because his narcissism was a terminal disease, he immediately pivoted. He turned back to me, attempting to salvage his bruised ego and reassert his dominance. Fine, Harrison snapped, adjusting his collar as if physically putting his CEO armor back on. My family made a terrible, idiotic mistake. I will handle them later. But this does not change the fact that you owe me Natalie. The acquiring board is terrified of these rumors. You are still going to issue a public statement clearing my name and backing my company. I am not losing my $300 million buyout because of this petty domestic drama. I just smiled. It was the calmest, coldest smile I had ever given him. Before I could even speak, Derek cleared his throat. He had not sat back down. He was still standing at the head of the table, his hands resting flat on the mahogany surface. Harrison, Derek said, his voice cutting through the tension like a sharpened scalpel. You really need to stop giving her orders. Harrison glared at his brother-in-law. I told you to stay out of my business, Derek. You proved your point about the articles. Now sit down and keep your mouth shut. I am dealing with my wife and my company. Derek did not move an inch. He reached into the thick manila folder and pulled out one final document. It was not a bank statement. It was a dense, highly classified corporate ownership chart. When I was tracking the funds your mother used to pay the bloggers, Derek explained calmly, I realized the journalists were focusing heavily on the specific structure of Natalie Private Equity Firm. So out of professional curiosity, I ran a deep forensic audit on her firm public holdings. I wanted to see just how massive her portfolio actually was. Derek slid the paper across the table. It stopped right in front of Harrison. I found something incredibly interesting about the holding company that is buying your startup. Harrison stared at the paper. He did not want to pick it up. Every time Derek had produced a piece of paper tonight, Harrison's world had cracked a little more. What is it? Harrison demanded, his voice suddenly sounding very small and tight. Derek pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. The acquiring firm, Derek said, speaking slowly so every single syllable echoed in the quiet room, the massive corporate entity that is supposedly handing you $300 million tomorrow morning. It is not an independent buyer. It is a wholly owned subsidiary of a parent corporation based in Delaware. Derek tapped his index finger directly on the top box of the organizational chart. And that parent corporation is fully controlled and funded by your wife private equity fund. Harrison physically stumbled backward, his hip hitting the edge of the dining room sideboard. All the air left his lungs in a sharp gasp. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and disbelief. The emergency board meeting, the sudden compliance audit, the threats to pull out of the deal, it was all orchestrated. I was the one holding the strings the entire time. I was the one threatening to tank his company. The room was spinning for Harrison. His mother was completely speechless. His sister looked like she was going to be physically sick. Derek looked right at the man who had treated him like garbage for years and delivered the final fatal blow of the evening. She does not just have more money than you, Harrison, Derek said quietly. She is your boss. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Nobody moved. Harrison stared at me, his chest heaving as the reality of his situation finally breached his thick skull. The woman he had treated like a subservient accessory for 2 years was the apex predator holding the leash to his entire company. Derek did not say another word. He simply closed his heavy manila folder, picked it up, and walked out of the dining room, leaving his wife and mother-in-law sitting in frozen shock. Beatrice buried her face in her hands, and Caroline stared blankly at the wall. Harrison did not apologize. He did not ask for mercy. A normal person would have begged for forgiveness, but narcissism is a powerful shield against reality. His shock rapidly mutated into a desperate, frantic rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisted with venom. You think you have won? He spat, his voice echoing off the marble floors. You think you can just buy my life and put me on a leash? This is my company, Natalie. I built it from nothing. I will burn it to the ground before I let you take my seat. He stormed out of this penthouse, slamming the heavy oak door so hard the framed mirrors on the walls rattled. I remained at the table, calmly finishing my glass of water. I knew exactly where he was going. He was going to war. It was past midnight when Harrison burst into his corporate headquarters. The massive glass building was empty, except for a few tired janitors polishing the lobby floors. He bypassed his own executive office and marched straight into the sprawling suite belonging to his chief financial officer. The CFO was a man named Gregory. Gregory was notoriously slimy, a corporate mercenary who cared only about his year-end bonuses and possessed the moral backbone of a jellyfish. He was packing his briefcase to leave when Harrison locked the door behind him. Harrison paced the floor rapidly, explaining the catastrophic situation. He revealed that the holding company acquiring them was secretly controlled by my private equity firm. Gregory went pale, dropping his expensive leather briefcase onto the floor. He immediately started panicking, realizing that a ruthless private equity takeover usually meant the entire executive team would be fired and liquidated without a single dollar of severance. Harrison slammed his hands onto Gregory's desk, demanding that he pull up the company capitalization table on the main monitor. "We are not rolling over for her," Harrison barked, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "We are going to dilute her voting power before the ink on the merger documents dries." Harrison laid out his desperate strategy. He wanted Gregory to exploit a forgotten loophole in the original startup charter. They were going to secretly authorize and issue a massive block of new Class A voting shares. They would categorize this sudden, unprecedented stock issuance as an emergency executive retention package. By flooding the internal market with these new shares and distributing them solely to Harrison and 3 of his blindly loyal board members, they would artificially inflate their own voting power overnight. This massive dilution would instantly shrink the percentage of the company currently controlled by my firm, dropping my equity well below the majority threshold. It would strip me of the power to fire him, giving Harrison complete control of the board. He would hold my acquisition hostage and force me to either walk away or buy him out at an astronomical premium. Gregory stared at Harrison like he had lost his mind. He pushed his chair back from the monitors, shaking his head vigorously. "Harrison, you are talking about issuing phantom shares hours before a finalized merger?" Gregory said, his voice cracking with severe anxiety. "We already filed the preliminary disclosures. If we alter the capitalization table now and hide it from the primary investors, it is textbook securities fraud. If we get caught, I will lose my license and we will both go to federal prison. I will not do it." Harrison grabbed Gregory by the collar of his expensive shirt, pulling him over the desk. "If you do not do this, she will fire you tomorrow morning," Harrison snarled. "You will get nothing. Do this, and we keep our company." Gregory swallowed hard, looking at the desperate, crazed look in Harrison's eyes. The CFO slowly, gently peeled Harrison's hands off his collar. He smoothed out his shirt and leaned back in his chair, a slow, calculating smile creeping across his face. He realized he was holding the absolute only key to Harrison's survival. "I can push the paperwork through the backdoor channels," Gregory said quietly. "I can manipulate the ledger to make the new shares look like a standard pre-merger adjustment. But taking on this level of massive federal risk requires aggressive compensation. I want $5 million, in cash, wired directly to a secure, untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands before I hit the execute button." While Harrison was desperately bribing his chief financial officer in a dimly lit office, I was standing in the center of my glass-enclosed boardroom overlooking the sleeping city. It was 3 a.m. I had not slept. I did not need to. The long mahogany table was surrounded by the sharpest legal and financial minds in New York. My senior crisis management team had assembled within 30 minutes of my call. There was no panic in this room. There were only printed financial ledgers, steaming cups of black coffee, and the quiet hum of absolute competence. At the far end of the table sat Richard, my head of corporate intelligence. He typed rapidly on his laptop and projected a live data feed onto the massive glass screen on the wall. Harrison just authorized a $5 million wire transfer from a secure shell account, Richard announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. The funds are bouncing through 3 intermediary banks and landing in a Cayman Islands trust controlled by his chief financial officer, Gregory. They are initiating a backdoor share issuance. They are attempting a massive illegal dilution of our voting equity to block the merger. A low murmur of disbelief went around the table. My lead litigation attorney, an older man named Thomas, leaned forward and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He looked at the projected data with deep professional disgust. "This is textbook securities fraud," Thomas growled, slamming his heavy silver pen on the table. "Harrison is cornered, so he is choosing to detonate a financial bomb. We have to file an emergency injunction immediately. I can wake up a federal judge right now and have the corporate ledgers frozen before the market opens in a few hours. We will drag Harrison out of his office in handcuffs by sunrise and have Gregory disbarred by noon." Several heads nodded in agreement, but Thomas held up a hand, looking directly at me. "We do not need to play games with this amateur," Thomas continued, his tone filled with absolute respect. "Natalie, you systematically dismantled 3 of the most aggressive hedge funds on Wall Street before your 30th birthday. You gutted their leadership, stripped their assets, and left their managing partners begging for early retirement. You did that against financial titans. Harrison is just a tech founder with a bloated ego and a panicked accountant. We crush him right here. We stop the dilution, we freeze his assets, and we terminate him with cause before he even finishes his morning coffee." I stood perfectly still, watching the data cascade across the glass screen. I looked at the routing numbers flying across the globe, hiding the dirty money. I thought about the engagement dinner in the Hamptons. I thought about the 50-page prenuptial agreement thrown onto my plate like a piece of garbage. I thought about the sheer arrogance of a man who believed he could bully me into submission because he assumed I was weak. Stopping him now would save the merger, but it would leave him with a golden parachute, a massive executive severance package, and a permanent victim narrative. He would spend the rest of his life telling people his vicious wife stole his company. I did not want his company, I wanted his absolute ruin. "No," I said, my voice slicing through the boardroom. "Nobody is calling a judge. Nobody is filing an injunction. We are going to let the wire transfer clear." The room went completely silent. Thomas frowned, leaning back in his leather chair, clearly confused by my directive. "Natalie, if we let him authorize those new Class A shares, he will successfully dilute our voting bloc. He will artificially inflate his own equity and effectively steal control of the board back from us right before the acquisition closes. He will hold the entire deal hostage." "Exactly," I replied, walking slowly toward the glass screen. "Right now, he is just a terrible husband trying to protect his job. If we stop him legally, he walks away bruised but financially intact. He keeps his private bank accounts and his luxury real estate. But if we let him execute this dilution, he crosses a fatal line that he can never walk back from. He commits massive federal securities fraud and takes on highly leveraged illegal debt to fund this bribe." I turned to face my team, my expression completely unreadable. He thinks he is building a fortress to keep us out, but he is actually building a financial guillotine for his own neck. We are not going to stop his illegal dilution. We are going to weaponize it. We let him issue the shares, we let him take on the toxic debt, and then we pull the floor out from under him when he has absolutely nothing left to leverage. Let him think he has won. By 8 a.m. the next morning, Harrison was sitting at his desk looking like a man who had not slept in days. The $5 million bribe had successfully landed in his chief financial officer offshore account. Gregory had immediately initiated the backdoor protocols to generate the new Class A voting shares. But creating the phantom equity was only the first half of their illegal equation. In order for the dilution to become legally binding, Harrison actually had to purchase the newly minted shares. He needed to inject real capital into the company ledger to justify the massive shift in voting power. He needed $50 million in liquid cash by the end of the business day. Harrison was asset-rich but cash-poor. His entire net worth was locked up in the impending merger, and the luxury real estate he had aggressively purchased to maintain his public image. He spent the entire morning making panicked, frantic phone calls to his traditional wealth managers and elite banking contacts. Every single one of them turned him down. Traditional banks refused to touch a massive, undocumented personal loan just days before a major corporate acquisition. The compliance departments flagged the request as a massive regulatory risk. Harrison slammed his phone down repeatedly, his frustration boiling over into blind panic. With traditional avenues completely closed, Gregory quietly suggested the shadow banking sector. The chief financial officer knew a private broker who dealt in mezzanine debt. It was a tier of unregulated, aggressive private credit designed specifically for desperate executives who needed massive amounts of cash immediately and were willing to pay astronomical interest rates to get it. By noon, a faceless corporate attorney carrying a slim black briefcase arrived at Harrison's office. The attorney represented an anonymous private lender who was willing to wire $50 million into Harrison's personal account within the hour. But the terms of the mezzanine loan were absolutely predatory. It was a financial death warrant disguised as a lifeline. The interest rate was staggering. The repayment window was brutally short, demanding full satisfaction immediately following the public announcement of his corporate merger. But the most dangerous part of the contract was the collateral requirement. To secure the $50 million, the anonymous lender demanded a blanket lien on Harrison's entire life. He had to leverage his multi-million-dollar penthouse. He had to leverage his personal investment portfolios. And most importantly, he had to pledge every single one of his original legally clean founder shares as absolute security against the debt. The contract contained a ruthless cross-default covenant. If Harrison violated even the smallest term, if he missed a single regulatory filing, or if the company suffered any sudden negative financial event, the lender possessed the legal right to instantly call the loan in full. If Harrison could not pay the $50 million back immediately, the lender would automatically seize his penthouse and entirely absorb his original founder shares, stripping him of everything he owned. Gregory read the terms and actually turned pale. He strongly advised Harrison to walk away. Even the slimy accountant recognized a suicide pact when he saw one. He warned Harrison that if anything delayed the merger, he would be completely ruined. But Harrison's narcissism was a terminal disease. He looked at the paperwork not as a trap, but as a temporary inconvenience. He firmly believed his own genius would carry him through. He convinced himself that as soon as the dilution was executed, he would regain total control of the board. He would force my private equity firm to finalize the acquisition on his terms. Once the hundreds of millions of dollars cleared, he would simply pay off the predatory loan and laugh about the risk. He thought he was outsmarting everyone. He thought he was playing four-dimensional chess while the rest of the world was playing checkers. Harrison did not hesitate. He grabbed his pen and aggressively signed his name on every single page of the dense legal contract, pledging his home, his company, and his future. The faceless attorney calmly collected the paperwork and made a single phone call. Within 15 minutes, Harrison's computer chimed. He opened his banking portal and stared at the screen with a triumphant, greedy smile. $50 million had just successfully cleared into his account. He immediately transferred the funds to Gregory to finalize the purchase of the phantom shares, officially executing the illegal dilution. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, feeling like an absolute king. He had secured his throne. He casually glanced back at the digital wire receipt to look at the origin of his financial salvation. There was no bank name. There was no corporate logo. The $50 million had been wired from a completely anonymous offshore shell company registered to a vacant post office box in the British Virgin Islands. Harrison did not care. He had the money and he was ready to destroy me. He had no idea he had just handed me the deed to his entire existence. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock the following morning. Harrison walked into the glass conference room, carrying himself with the swagger of an undefeated champion. Gregory, the chief financial officer, flanked him, looking sweaty but visibly relieved. I sat quietly at the opposite end of the mahogany table, flanked by two of my junior attorneys. Harrison did not waste any time. He called the meeting to order and presented the revised capitalization table. He announced the issuance of the new Class A voting shares, framing it as a critical executive retention strategy necessary to stabilize the company. My attorneys launched into a rehearsed performance of absolute outrage. They cited corporate bylaws, threatened litigation, and aggressively accused Harrison of acting in bad faith. Harrison soaked up their frustration like sunlight. He smugly reminded them that according to the founding charter, he still retained emergency executive authority to authorize the issuance. He called for an immediate vote, with his blindly loyal board members falling in line and the newly minted shares artificially inflating his voting power. The motion passed effortlessly. My private equity firm was officially diluted. My controlling majority was instantly reduced to a minority stake. My attorneys packed their briefcases in simulated disgust and stormed out of the room. I remained seated, perfectly playing the role of the defeated wife. Harrison leaned across the wide table, resting his weight on his knuckles. He flashed a brilliant, triumphant smile. "You played a good game, Natalie," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you forgot one crucial detail. I built this company. I know every loophole and every leverage point. You are a minority shareholder now. I control the merger, and I control our future. You can go back to managing our household calendar." I did not argue. I simply nodded, stood up, and quietly left the building. Harrison was completely drunk on his own perceived genius. He firmly believed he had outsmarted a Wall Street titan. To celebrate his massive victory, he demanded that we attend the annual New York Tech Innovators Gala that evening. It was a highly exclusive black tie event held in the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel. He explicitly told me to wear something elegant but understated. He wanted to parade me around the room as his conquered trophy wife. I complied without a single word of protest. I wore a simple black silk gown and stood quietly by his side as we navigated the crowded ballroom. Flashbulbs went off as industry photographers documented the arrival of the tech world's newest billionaire. Harrison worked the room with manic energy. He shook hands, clapped investors on the shoulder, and aggressively bragged about his upcoming $300 million merger. Every time someone asked about me, he would pull me close by the waist, giving me a patronizing squeeze. "This is my beautiful wife Natalie," he would say to the crowd of wealthy executives. "She dabbles a bit in boutique finance, but honestly, her real full-time job is keeping my chaotic life organized. She is my rock." The executives would chuckle politely, completely oblivious to the fact that I could buy and sell every single person in that circle before breakfast. Beatrice and Caroline were also in attendance, having been flown in on Harrison's temporary wave of financial euphoria. They stood by the champagne tower glaring at me with renewed arrogance. They genuinely thought Harrison had put me permanently back in my place. They thought their extortion attempts were completely forgotten and that they were back on top of the social hierarchy. Harrison raised his crystal glass of champagne, gesturing for his inner circle of developers and investors to gather around. He delivered an impromptu toast, loudly mocking the predatory vultures of Wall Street who thought they could swoop in and steal the hard work of true tech innovators. He looked directly at me while he said it, his eyes gleaming with malicious victory. He thought he had completely neutralized me. He thought the mezzanine loan he took out to fund his illegal dilution was a brilliant tactical maneuver. He had absolutely no idea that the anonymous offshore shell company holding the $50 million note was fully owned and operated by my primary holding fund. The orchestra began playing a lively jazz number and the crowd dispersed toward the dance floor. Harrison turned to Gregory, demanding another round of drinks. I took a slow, deliberate step back, slipping away from his side and melting into the quiet shadows near the velvet-draped walls of the ballroom. I opened my designer clutch and pulled out my secure phone. I opened the encrypted messaging application and selected the chat with Thomas, my lead litigation attorney. I watched Harrison laughing hysterically across the room, completely unaware that he was standing on a financial landmine. I typed 3 simple words: spring the trap. The morning after the tech gala, Beatrice was riding a wave of absolute euphoria. She had spoken to Harrison late the previous night, and he proudly confirmed that the dilution was a complete success. He assured her that my private equity firm had been stripped of its controlling power and that his upcoming $300 million merger was entirely secure. Beatrice, being a woman who measured her self-worth strictly through public perception, decided this monumental victory required an immediate and lavish celebration. By noon, she had organized an extravagant impromptu luncheon at her highly exclusive country club in Westchester. She invited 50 of her wealthiest friends, socialites, and local politicians. She wanted an audience to witness her family triumph over the woman she considered a manipulative gold digger. I was obviously not invited, but my intelligence team had eyes everywhere. They monitored the situation closely, providing me with live audio and video feeds through discrete channels. I sat in my Wall Street office, sipping sparkling water and watching Beatrice seal her own fate. The country club dining room was decorated with massive floral arrangements and towering ice sculptures. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of expensive vintage champagne. Beatrice stood at the center of the room, wearing a bright silk dress holding a crystal flute. She was loudly holding court, telling a heavily embellished version of the boardroom coup. She boasted about how her brilliant son had legally outmaneuvered a ruthless Wall Street firm and protected their generational wealth. Caroline stood right beside her, laughing at all the right moments and soaking in the admiration of the wealthy crowd. Beatrice felt completely invincible. She believed her lifestyle was permanently guaranteed by Harrison, new corporate dominance. What she fundamentally failed to understand was that her luxurious lifestyle had always been a house of cards built on a foundation of severe financial fraud. For over a decade, Beatrice had been secretly using Harrison corporate accounts to fund her personal expenses. She had categorized her designer clothes, luxury vacations, and expensive dinners as deductible business expenses, avoiding massive amounts of state and federal taxes. Harrison had always turned a blind eye to it, and his slimy chief financial officer, Gregory, had eagerly buried the discrepancies to keep the family happy. But Derek, the quiet, analytical forensic accountant she had treated like a second-class citizen, had never missed a single irregular transaction. Before Derek walked out of our penthouse and served Caroline with divorce papers, he had quietly compiled a massive, meticulously documented dossier of Beatrice's tax evasion. He did not just show it to Harrison at the dinner table. He had forwarded the entire encrypted file directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. At exactly 1 o'clock, the string quartet playing in the corner of the dining room abruptly stopped. The heavy mahogany doors of the country club swung open. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with federal insignias printed on the back walked into the lavish room. They were accompanied by armed state police officers. The joyful chatter of the high society crowd instantly died, completely replaced by a tense, terrified silence. Beatrice lowered her champagne flute, her face twisting into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. She stepped forward, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Excuse me," Beatrice demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "This is a private event. You cannot just barge into a private country club. I want to speak to the manager immediately." A tall, stern-looking federal agent stepped past the ice sculpture and walked directly up to Beatrice. He did not look intimidated by her silk dress or her expensive jewelry. He pulled a thick, folded document from his jacket pocket and held it up. "Beatrice," he said, his voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "We have a federal warrant for your immediate detainment and the seizure of all related financial documents. You are under investigation for massive corporate tax evasion, wire fraud, and the embezzlement of company funds." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, dropping her crystal flute. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor. "This is absurd," she sputtered, her face turning a blotchy red. "My son is a highly successful chief executive officer. We have the best corporate lawyers in the city. Whoever fed you these ridiculous lies is going to be sued for defamation." The federal agent did not even blink. The detailed forensic audit we received from a licensed accountant named Derek provided overwhelming verifiable proof of your crimes, the agent replied flatly. Caroline let out a loud, hysterical sob covering her mouth as the reality of her estranged husband's actions finally hit her. Beatrice started panicking, reaching into her designer handbag with trembling fingers. "I am calling my attorney right now," she threatened, pulling out her phone and a platinum credit card. "I will post whatever massive bail you want, and I will have your job by tomorrow morning." The agent signaled to two officers who stepped forward to flank Beatrice. "You will not be posting bail with that card," the agent informed her coldly. "As of 10 minutes ago, a federal judge signed an emergency injunction. Every single bank account, investment portfolio, and property attached to your name has been completely frozen. You have absolutely nothing." Harrison was sitting in his executive office nursing a slight hangover from the tech gala and enjoying his perceived absolute power. His phone began vibrating aggressively across his mahogany desk. The caller identification flashed his sister's name. He let it ring a few times, savoring his own importance before finally answering. He expected Caroline to be calling to complain about some minor inconvenience or ask for a fresh infusion of shopping money. Instead, Caroline was completely hysterical. She was sobbing so violently that Harrison could barely understand her words. Between panicked gasps, she managed to explain that federal agents had just raided Beatrice's exclusive country club luncheon. Their mother had been publicly arrested, dragged out in front of the entire Westchester high society, and thrown into the back of a federal vehicle. Her personal accounts were completely frozen, and she was being held on massive federal charges of corporate embezzlement and tax evasion. Harrison stood up so fast his heavy leather chair slammed into the glass wall behind him. His initial reaction was not concern for his mother, but pure unfiltered panic for his impending merger. A federal investigation into his company finances just days before the acquisition was a catastrophic disaster. The acquiring holding company would run away screaming if they caught wind of an FBI raid tied to his corporate funds. He told Caroline to calm down and stop crying. He promised he would handle it. He said he would wire whatever exorbitant bail amount was required and hire the most ruthless defense attorneys in New York to sweep the entire mess under the rug. He hung up the phone and immediately opened his laptop, logging into his primary corporate banking portal. He needed to transfer $3 million to a legal retainer account immediately to silence the problem. When the screen loaded, his blood ran completely cold. Instead of his massive cash balances, he saw a stark red banner stretched across the top of the portal. Access denied. Account frozen, pending federal inquiry. Harrison grabbed his phone and dialed Gregory, his chief financial officer. Gregory answered on the first ring, sounding like a man about to suffer a massive heart attack. Gregory frantically explained that the federal agents had served emergency warrants on the corporate bank. Because Beatrice had used the company ledgers to facilitate her tax evasion, the government had legally frozen every single operational account tied to the business until a complete forensic audit could be conducted. Harrison was completely cut off from his own money. He could not bail his mother out, he could not hire lawyers, he could not even pay for his own lunch. He needed liquid cash immediately, and he could not go to traditional banks with a federal investigation actively locking down his assets. Desperation completely clouded his judgment. He opened his secure safe and pulled out the business card of the faceless corporate attorney who had brokered his $50 million mezzanine loan just yesterday. He remembered the attorney mentioning that the shadow lender possessed vast reserves of capital for executives in immediate distress. Harrison figured he could leverage the rest of his unpledged startup equity to secure a quick emergency cash injection. It was a terrible idea, but he had absolutely no other options. He dialed the number. The attorney answered immediately, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of emotion. "I need an emergency draw," Harrison demanded, pacing back and forth across his office. "I need $10 million wired to an independent offshore account within the hour. Name your interest rate." "I do not care." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I am afraid that will be completely impossible, Harrison the attorney replied coldly. In fact, I was just about to call you. The lender has been monitoring your situation closely. We are fully aware of the federal raid on your mother and the subsequent freezing of your corporate accounts. Harrison stopped pacing. How do you know about that? He asked, his voice trembling. It just happened 20 minutes ago. The shadow banking sector moves faster than the press, the attorney stated. And unfortunately, your current situation presents a severe legal problem. When you signed the mezzanine debt contract yesterday, you agreed to a strict morality and stability covenant. A federal criminal investigation into your corporate accounts constitutes a massive material adverse change to your financial risk profile. Harrison felt his stomach drop into his shoes. What are you saying? He whispered. I am saying you are in breach of contract, Harrison. The lender has officially triggered the cross-default clause. The loan is being called in early. Harrison grabbed the edge of his desk, trying to keep himself upright. You cannot do this, he pleaded. My merger closes next week. I will have hundreds of millions of dollars. The lender does not care about your merger, the attorney said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You have exactly 24 hours to repay the $50 million in full. If the money is not wired into our account by tomorrow afternoon, the lender will execute the collateral seizure. They will foreclose on your penthouse, and they will legally absorb every single one of your voting shares. Have a good day, Harrison. The line went dead. Harrison dropped the phone onto his desk. The trap had finally snapped shut, and he was going to lose absolutely everything. Harrison spent the next 24 hours trapped in a downward spiral of absolute desperation. He paced the hardwood floors of the penthouse until his feet physically blistered. He called every single contact in his phone. He begged venture capitalists he had previously insulted. He even tried to reach out to my lawyers, demanding a massive divorce settlement advance. My team simply ignored his frantic voicemails. The $50 million deadline came and went with brutal indifference. The shadow lender did not grant him a single minute of grace. As the clock struck 3 the following afternoon, his legal ownership of the luxury penthouse and every single one of his voting shares evaporated. He was officially a tenant in a home he no longer owned, and a minority shareholder in a company he no longer controlled. The next morning, the reality of his default arrived at the front door. I was not there to witness it, having permanently relocated to a secure suite at the Four Seasons, but the building management reports and my private security logs detailed the entire humiliating event. At exactly 8 o'clock, a team of private security contractors accompanied by 2 ruthless eviction attorneys stepped off the private elevator directly into the penthouse foyer. Harrison was sitting on the velvet sofa, wearing the same wrinkled clothes from the day before, staring blankly at the wall. The attorneys did not offer any sympathy or professional courtesy. They handed him a heavily stamped court order, demanding he vacate the premises immediately. Harrison tried to argue. He yelled that he was a highly respected chief executive officer and that they could not treat him like a common squatter. The lead attorney calmly informed him that the property title had already been legally transferred to the offshore holding company. They gave him exactly 2 hours to pack his personal clothing into a few suitcases before the locks would be permanently changed and the remaining assets liquidated. His priceless art collection, his custom furniture, and his imported sports car parked in the basement were all seized as collateral against the massive debt he could not pay. While Harrison was frantically shoving designer suits into a canvas duffel bag, the private elevator pinged open again. Caroline rushed into the foyer looking completely disheveled. She had spent the entire night hiding from the press after her mother was carted off to federal prison. She had come to the penthouse seeking shelter and financial protection from her wealthy brother. Instead, she walked into a chaotic scene of security guards packing boxes and lawyers inventorying the expensive silverware. When she realized Harrison had lost the penthouse and the company shares, she suffered a complete meltdown right in the middle of the marble entryway. Caroline realized her entire safety net was completely gone. Her mother was in jail with frozen accounts. Her brother was being actively evicted and drowning in unregulated debt. The only person left in her orbit who actually had any liquid capital was her husband. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed Derek. She put him on speakerphone, hoping the sheer panic in her voice would force him to step up and act like the savior she desperately needed. Derek answered after the fourth ring. His voice was calm, steady, and entirely unbothered. Caroline immediately launched into a hysterical plea. She told him about the foreclosure, the security guards, and Harrison's massive defaulted loan. She begged Derek to transfer his personal savings to stop the bleeding. She knew Derek had millions safely tucked away in conservative index funds and high-yield accounts. She cried that they needed his money to hire lawyers for Beatrice and to secure a temporary luxury apartment to protect the family image from complete social ruin. She told him it was his duty as her husband to rescue them. The line was quiet for a long moment. Only the sound of Harrison violently zipping a suitcase broke the silence in the penthouse. Then Derek finally spoke, his voice cutting through the panic with surgical precision. Caroline, I spent 5 years watching your family flaunt your wealth while treating me like an uneducated servant, Derek said coldly. I warned your brother about his greed. I warned your mother about her fraud. You all chose to ignore me because you thought you were untouchable. My money is clean, and it is staying exactly where it is. I am not spending a single dime of my hard-earned savings to rescue a family image that was entirely fake to begin with. I will be sending a moving crew to collect my personal belongings from our house this afternoon. Derek added his tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. You should probably start packing your own bags, Caroline, because I am breaking our lease tomorrow morning. Good luck with your brother. The call disconnected, leaving Caroline staring at a dead screen while the security guards physically escorted her bankrupt brother toward the service elevator. Caroline stood in the marble lobby of Harrison's former building, clutching her phone as the dial tone buzzed endlessly in her ear. Harrison was standing on the sidewalk next to a canvas duffel bag, looking completely hollowed out. Without a single dollar between them and their mother sitting in a federal holding cell, they had only one option left. They hailed a cab using the last few crumpled bills in Caroline's designer purse and headed straight for the upscale Tribeca apartment she shared with Derek. They fully intended to corner him in person, relying on their usual family tactics of bullying and intense guilt to force his hand. When they pushed open the heavy front door of the apartment, they were met with a scene of absolute efficiency. 3 professional movers were already carefully wrapping furniture and boxing up electronics. Derek was standing in the master bedroom, calmly folding a row of tailored suits into a sleek leather garment bag. He did not look surprised to see them bursting through the door. He did not look angry or upset. He looked completely liberated. Harrison marched into the bedroom, attempting to summon whatever lingering executive authority he thought he still possessed. "You cannot do this to us," Derek Harrison barked, pointing a shaking finger at his brother-in-law. "My company is just going through a temporary liquidity crisis. My mother is being falsely accused by the government. You are going to liquidate your index funds right now and wire the money to my legal team. We are family, and you owe us your loyalty." Derek did not even look up from his packing. He meticulously smoothed out the lapel of a charcoal jacket. "You do not have a company anymore, Harrison." Derek replied, his voice smooth and devastatingly calm. "I read the terms of that mezzanine loan you signed. It is public record now. You pledged your founder shares and your home. The lender legally absorbed everything at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. You are officially unemployed, and from the look of that duffel bag, you are also homeless. I do not take orders from bankrupt men." Harrison opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The sheer blunt force of Derek's words completely shattered his delusional reality. Caroline pushed past her brother, her face streaming with desperate tears. She tried to grab Derek's arm, but he smoothly stepped away, pulling his garment bag zipped shut. "Derek, please," Caroline begged, switching effortlessly to the role of the devoted, heartbroken wife. "We took sacred vows, for better or for worse. You cannot just abandon me when things get difficult. I love you." Derek finally stopped moving. He turned to face Caroline, reaching into the inner pocket of his blazer. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and pressed it firmly against her chest until she was forced to take it from him. "We did take vows," Caroline, Derek said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, with absolute zero warmth. "But you broke yours about 3 years ago." Caroline looked down at the envelope, her hands shaking violently. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Those are the final divorce papers," Derek stated clearly, his voice carrying out into the hallway for Harrison to hear perfectly. "You completely forgot who you married, Caroline. I am a forensic accountant. I track hidden assets and financial discrepancies for a living. Did you really think I would not notice the massive irregularities in our joint accounts? Did you honestly think I would not trace the cash withdrawals you used to fund your weekly shopping sprees while lying to me about the rising cost of household expenses?" Caroline tried to speak, but Derek cut her off, stepping closer and forcing her to back up against the wall. And more importantly, he continued, his tone turning to pure ice. "Did you really think I would not audit the credit card statements to find those boutique hotel charges in Manhattan every Tuesday afternoon? I have the receipts, Caroline. I have the security footage from the hotel lobby. I have the encrypted text messages between you and your personal trainer. I have meticulously documented every single instance of your chronic infidelity and your financial abuse over the last 36 months. Caroline's face drained of all color. She dropped the envelope onto the hardwood floor, the heavy divorce papers spilling out across the room. She was completely exposed. There was no defense and no lie she could spin to talk her way out of this. Her secret life had been expertly catalogued by the husband she thought was too boring and too stupid to notice. Derek picked up his overnight bag and slipped on his tailored coat. He looked at the two siblings standing in the half-empty bedroom. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their arrogance, and their power. They looked exactly like what they truly were, two greedy parasites who had finally run out of hosts to feed on. "My lawyers will handle the rest," Derek said, walking out of the bedroom. He paused at the front door, handing his spare keys to the lead mover. "Finish packing everything with a red tag. The landlord knows they have until tomorrow morning to vacate the premises." Derek stepped out into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He left the family in absolute ruins, walking out into the New York streets, a completely free man. Harrison stood on the sidewalk outside the Tribeca apartment building, clutching his canvas duffel bag. His sister Caroline was sitting on a nearby bench, weeping openly into her hands. The humiliation of Derek walking out on them was absolute, but Harrison did not have the luxury of mourning his sister's broken marriage. He pulled out his phone and checked the time. It was exactly 10 in the morning. The shadow lender had kicked him out of the penthouse and initiated the asset seizure, but the actual corporate voting shares required a mandatory federal cooling-off period before the transfer could be permanently registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Harrison knew the law. The final ledger update was scheduled for exactly 5 o'clock that afternoon. If he could somehow wire $50 million to the offshore shell company before the closing bell rang, he could halt the transfer, reclaim his equity, and save his position in the upcoming merger. He had 7 hours to find a white knight. He left Caroline crying on the street and walked into a nearby coffee shop, commandeering a corner table. He opened his laptop and began blasting emails and frantic text messages to every high-net-worth individual he had ever crossed paths with. He was offering astronomical returns, desperate terms, and massive discounts on his future equity. For 2 hours, he received nothing but automated out-of-office replies and polite but firm rejections. The tech community smelled blood in the water, and nobody wanted to step between a bleeding founder and a shadow lender. Just before 1 o'clock, his phone finally buzzed with a response. It was an assistant to a man named Maxwell. Maxwell was a legendary venture capitalist in New York. He was notorious for his absolute ruthlessness. He was a vulture investor who specialized in finding desperate, over-leveraged tech founders, stripping their companies for parts, and leaving them with nothing. Under normal circumstances, Harrison would never allow a predator like Maxwell anywhere near his boardroom. But today, Harrison was the prey, and he had absolutely no other options. The assistant informed him that Maxwell would give him exactly 10 minutes to pitch his survival strategy at his private club in Midtown. Harrison grabbed his duffel bag and took a subway to Midtown, lacking the funds for a private car. He arrived at the exclusive club sweating through his wrinkled dress shirt. He was escorted into a dim oak-paneled reading room where Maxwell was sitting in a high-backed leather chair smoking a cigar and reviewing a tablet. Maxwell did not offer to shake hands. He simply pointed his cigar at the empty chair across from him and told Harrison to start talking. Harrison launched into the most aggressive, desperate pitch of his entire life. He explained the upcoming $300 million merger, omitting the fact that my private equity firm was secretly controlling the acquiring holding company. He painted a picture of a massive guaranteed payday that was being temporarily blocked by a minor liquidity crisis. He asked Maxwell for a $50 million bridge loan, promising to pay back $75 million the absolute second the merger finalized next week. It was a 50% return on investment in a matter of days. Maxwell listened in complete silence. He puffed slowly on his cigar, his cold gray eyes analyzing the sweating, panicked man sitting in front of him. When Harrison finally finished his frantic pitch, Maxwell set his tablet face down on the small wooden table between them. "You are lying to me, Harrison," Maxwell said, his voice deep and gravelly. "You do not have a minor liquidity crisis. You took on toxic mezzanine debt to fund an illegal share dilution because your board is actively trying to oust you. Your mother was raided by the federal government yesterday, and your corporate accounts are completely frozen. You are radioactive." Harrison felt his chest tighten. "How do you know all of that?" he choked out. "It is my job to know when a fool is bleeding to death on my doorstep," Maxwell replied coldly. "But despite your staggering incompetence, the underlying technology of your software startup still holds significant market value. The acquiring company wants the software, not you." Harrison leaned forward, desperation overriding his pride. "So you will fund the bridge loan?" he asked, his voice trembling with hope. "You will give me the $50 million. I will write the check right now," Maxwell said, reaching into his tailored jacket and pulling out a silver pen. "I will wire the funds directly to your shadow lender and halt the asset seizure before the federal deadline. I will save your company, but I do not want a 50% return on my money, Harrison. I want the steering wheel." Maxwell snapped his fingers, and his silent assistant stepped out of the shadows, placing a single sheet of paper on the table. "I will pay off your debt," Maxwell stated, blowing a thick cloud of smoke into the air. "But in exchange, you are going to sign over your proxy voting rights for every single one of your newly reclaimed shares. You will retain your financial equity for the buyout, but I will completely control your vote on the board of directors. You get the money, but I get the absolute power. Sign it or get out of my club." Harrison stared at the single sheet of paper resting on the small wooden table. Giving up his voting rights meant completely surrendering his identity as the visionary leader of his own company. He would become a highly paid figurehead, effectively castrated in his own boardroom. But the alternative was absolute annihilation. If the shadow lender executed the collateral seizure at 5 o'clock, he would lose the equity anyway and walk away with absolutely nothing. He swallowed his massive pride and reached for the silver pen. Before the pen could touch the paper, Maxwell's assistant placed a hand over the document. The assistant flipped to the second page, pointing to a blank signature block located at the very bottom. "There is one final compliance hurdle," the assistant stated smoothly. "New York State marital property laws are incredibly strict regarding the transfer of massive corporate equity assets. Even though you are transferring proxy voting rights rather than liquidating the shares directly, this transaction dramatically alters the marital financial profile. To make this proxy transfer legally airtight and shield our firm from future litigation, we require the notarized signature of your wife." Harrison dropped the pen as if it had suddenly caught fire. "You have to be joking," he gasped, his voice cracking. "She will never sign this. We are completely estranged. She moved out of my penthouse yesterday." Maxwell stood up, buttoning his tailored jacket. "That sounds like a personal problem," Harrison Maxwell said, looking down at him with absolute indifference. "I am not wiring $50 million to a shadow lender without total legal immunity. You have until exactly 4 o'clock to return to this club with her notarized signature. If you are 1 minute late, the offer is permanently rescinded. and I will happily buy your company for pennies after you declare bankruptcy tomorrow." Harrison sprinted out of the private club, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had less than 3 hours to track down the woman he had spent the last month trying to humiliate. He frantically called my former assistant and begged for my location. Pity must have gotten the better of her because she quietly informed him that I had taken up permanent residence in the presidential suite at the Four Seasons downtown. When Harrison arrived at my hotel suite, he did not knock with his usual arrogant authority. He pounded on the heavy wooden door like a drowning man begging for a life raft. My private security guards led him into the foyer after thoroughly searching him for weapons. I was sitting at a glass dining table overlooking the city, enjoying a light salad and reviewing the latest quarterly reports for my holding funds. Harrison stumbled into the room and completely collapsed. The immaculately dressed, arrogant chief executive officer was entirely gone. He fell to his knees on the thick hotel carpet, tears streaming down his face, clutching his canvas duffel bag. "Natalie, please," he sobbed, his voice echoing in the quiet suite. "I am begging you. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I set my fork down and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. "You look terrible, Harrison. What do you want?" He frantically pulled the crumpled proxy agreement from his jacket pocket and slid it across the glass table. He confessed everything. He told me about the shadow lender calling in the $50 million loan. He told me about the venture capitalist demanding his voting rights. But then, driven by pure terror, he confessed the darkest secret of all. "If I default on that loan, the lender takes my shares and the merger fails." Harrison wept, his hands shaking violently. "If the merger fails, the federal agents investigating my mother are going to tear my company ledger apart. They are going to find the $5 million offshore bribe I paid my chief financial officer to issue the phantom shares. I will not just go bankrupt, Natalie. I will go to federal prison for securities fraud. You have to sign this spousal consent form. I will give you anything you want. I will apologize to you every day for the rest of my life. Just save me." I looked down at the desperate, pathetic man kneeling on the floor. He was begging me to save him from a trap I had personally built. I picked up the proxy agreement and scanned the spousal consent clause. It was standard legal boilerplate. "I will sign it," I said, my voice perfectly calm. Harrison let out a massive, ragged gasp of relief. He reached out as if to touch my hand, but I quickly pulled it away. "But I have one condition." I continued, opening my leather briefcase, sitting on the chair next to me. I pulled out a separate, sleek black folder and placed it squarely on top of his proxy agreement. "You are asking me to risk my legal standing by authorizing this transfer. If you want my signature, you are going to sign a secondary document for me first." Harrison stared at the sleek black folder resting on top of his salvation. He wiped the tears from his face, leaving dark smudges of dirt and sweat across his cheeks. The clock on the wall of my hotel suite ticked loudly. It was already 3:15. He had exactly 45 minutes to get back to Midtown with my signature, or his entire life would be legally erased. "What is that?" Harrison asked, his voice raspy and weak. "Just a standard mutual release," I replied casually, pouring myself another glass of sparkling water. "It is a waiver regarding your executive severance package and future employment options. With the merger coming up and your board actively hostile toward you, there will likely be severe corporate restructuring. This simply guarantees that if you step down or are forced out of your chief executive role, I cannot be held liable for your sudden loss of income. It also ensures you surrender any golden parachute claims against our marital assets. It protects us both from future liabilities. It is just standard business protocol." Harrison hesitated, his eyes darting between the clock and the black folder. A tiny sliver of his former corporate instinct tried to warn him. He knew better than to sign a legal document without having his lawyers review every single comma. But his lawyers were ignoring his calls, and he had absolutely no leverage. He was a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, and I was holding the only rope. He looked at the thick stack of paper inside the folder. It was dense, filled with complicated legal jargon and tiny print. It would take him an hour just to read the first section. He did not have an hour. He had minutes. I slid a cheap plastic hotel pen across the glass table. It clattered against the folder. If you want my signature on your proxy agreement, you have to sign my waiver first, I stated firmly. The choice is yours, Harrison. Take the time to read it, and let the shadow lender seize your shares at 4 o'clock. Or sign it right now and run back to your white knight. Panic completely rewired his brain. He grabbed the cheap plastic pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it straight. He did exactly what I had done at the Hamptons' engagement dinner. He ignored the dense text completely. He did not read the executive clauses. He did not check the legal stipulations or the fine print at the bottom of the pages. He flipped frantically to the very last page where the blank signature line waited. He scribbled his name in a messy, rushed scrawl, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore through the thick parchment paper. He pushed the black folder back toward me, breathing heavily. I signed it. Harrison gasped. Now please sign the spousal consent. I am completely out of time. I smiled, a genuine warm smile. I picked up my solid gold Mont Blanc pen, uncapped it gracefully, and signed the spousal consent form in fluid, deliberate strokes. I handed his document back to him. Run, Harrison, I advised softly. He snatched the paper, scrambled off the floor, and bolted out of the hotel suite without another word. He sprinted through the lobby, ignoring the stares of the wealthy guests, and burst out onto the downtown street. Traffic on the avenues was completely gridlocked. There was no way a taxi would make it. He shoved a crumpled $50 bill into a stunned bicycle messenger hand, stole the man bicycle, and pedaled furiously up the avenues, dodging cars and pedestrians. He abandoned the bike on the sidewalk outside Maxwell Private Club, his lungs burning, and practically kicked the heavy oak doors open. It was 3 minutes to 4. Harrison staggered into the dim reading room, completely drenched in sweat, his chest heaving painfully. He slapped the crumpled spousal consent form onto the small wooden table right next to Maxwell's cigar ashtray. I got it, Harrison panted, collapsing into the leather chair. The signature is there. Wire the $50 million to the shadow lender. Stop the default. Maxwell did not move with any urgency. He calmly picked up the document, adjusting his reading glasses. He reviewed the notary stamp and the fluid, elegant signature at the bottom of the page. Then his cold gray eyes scanned the printed legal disclosure text just above the signature line. State law required the spousal consent to list the full financial identity of the signing party. It explicitly listed my full legal name alongside my title as the sole proprietor and managing director of the massive private equity fund that was acquiring Harrison's startup. Even worse, the document clearly noted my fund as the parent company of the offshore shell corporation holding his defaulted $50 million mezzanine debt. Maxwell stopped reading. The quiet atmosphere of the reading room was suddenly broken by a low rumble. The legendary cutthroat venture capitalist looked at the paper and then looked at the exhausted, pathetic man sitting across from him. Maxwell threw his head back and began to laugh. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a deep, booming, uncontrollable roar of absolute amusement. He laughed so hard he had to put his cigar down, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, while Harrison stared at him in complete, terrified confusion. Maxwell wiped a tear of genuine amusement from his eye and tossed the spousal consent form back across the small wooden table. Harrison just stared at him, his chest heaving with absolute panic. "What is funny?" Harrison demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Wire the money. It is 4 o'clock. I am not wiring you a single cent," Harrison Maxwell said, his laughter subsiding into a cold, ruthless smirk. "I am a predator, but I do not fight wars I cannot win." "You really are completely blind. Read the financial disclosure on the document your wife just signed. She is not just the managing director of the private equity firm buying your startup. She is the sole registered owner of the offshore shell company holding your $50 million mezzanine debt. She is your shadow lender, Harrison." Harrison felt the room violently spin. The air left his lungs. He looked down at the document. The printed text blurred together, but the truth was undeniable. I had loaned him the money to fund his own illegal bribe. I had set the trap, and he had eagerly jumped right into it. "Get out of my club," Maxwell ordered, signaling his silent assistant. "You defaulted 10 minutes ago. Your shares belong to her now." Harrison stumbled out onto the midtown sidewalk. The clock on his phone read 4:15. The shadow lender deadline had officially passed. He had defaulted. He was legally stripped of his equity and his penthouse. But Harrison was infected with a terminal case of narcissism. He simply could not accept that he had been completely defeated by the woman he had treated like a subservient accessory for 2 entire years. His brain immediately scrambled to construct a new reality to protect his fragile ego. He called Gregory his chief financial officer. Gregory was hyperventilating on the other end of the line, terrified of the impending federal fallout. The federal cooling-off period. Harrison yelled into the phone, aggressively pacing the crowded sidewalk. "The transfer of my voting shares to the shadow lender cannot be officially registered on the federal ledger until the markets open tomorrow morning. We still hold the physical proxy power until 9:30. Gregory begged him to surrender, but Harrison flatly refused. He commanded Gregory to proceed with the emergency shareholder meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. Harrison firmly believed that if he could push through a formal board vote to expel my private equity firm before the federal ledger officially updated, he could create a massive legal injunction. He thought he could tie the asset seizure up in court for years and force me to settle. It was the desperate, dangerous delusion of a completely broken man. The next morning, the atmosphere inside the sprawling corporate boardroom was absolutely electric. The massive glass-walled room overlooking the city was packed to absolute capacity. Every single executive board member and major investor was seated around the long mahogany table. Rumors about Beatrice being arrested by federal agents had already flooded the corporate gossip channels. Gregory sat near the front, sweating profusely and staring down at his blank legal pad. He knew they were standing on a live financial landmine, but he was too terrified to stop it. Harrison walked into the room wearing his most expensive tailored suit. He ignored the whispers and the glaring stares of his investors. He carried himself with the manufactured swagger of a returning conqueror. He walked straight to the podium at the head of the table, adjusting the microphone. He looked out over the crowded room, flashing his trademark arrogant smile. He genuinely believed his own bluff. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice booming confidently across the tense boardroom, "we are standing at the precipice of a historic new era for this company. Over the past few weeks, we have faced unprecedented hostile aggression from predatory Wall Street forces. A specific private equity firm attempted to silently infiltrate our board and steal the incredible value we have all worked so hard to build." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the room. He gestured toward the massive digital screen behind him, projecting the heavily doctored capitalization table showing his inflated equity. "But I am proud to announce that their hostile takeover has been completely neutralized." Harrison continued, his tone rising with triumphant energy. "Thanks to our emergency issuance of Class A voting shares, we have successfully secured the controlling majority of this corporation. I have saved this company. Today we are taking a formal shareholder vote to permanently expel that private equity firm from our board and reclaim our total independence." The room erupted into a low murmur of surprised approval from his blindly loyal board members. Harrison raised his hand to silence the room, ready to call for the immediate vote. He opened his mouth to deliver the final killing blow to my involvement in his company. He never got the chance. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a loud echoing crack. The entire room went completely silent as every single head turned toward the entrance. I walked into the boardroom. I was not wearing an understated dress or carrying a designer clutch. I was wearing a sharp-tailored power suit. Flanking me on my right was Thomas, my ruthless lead litigation attorney. Flanking me on my left was the faceless corporate lawyer who had brokered Harrison mezzanine loan. I walked straight down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, my eyes locked directly onto Harrison's terrified face. The heavy oak doors slamming open sucked all the air out of the massive glass-walled room. Harrison froze at the podium, his hand hovering mid-air. The arrogant smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at me, and then his eyes shifted to the faceless corporate lawyer standing on my left. The lawyer gave Harrison a slow, chilling nod. The reality of his situation began to fracture his manufactured confidence, but he was still standing in front of his entire board of directors. He tried to project power. "What is the meaning of this?" Harrison demanded, his voice shaking slightly over the microphone. "Security should not have let you in here. You are a minority shareholder, Natalie. You have no authority to interrupt an official board vote. I am asking you to leave before I have you physically removed." I did not stop walking until I reached the front of the mahogany table. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my sleek tablet onto the polished wood. Thomas, my lead litigation attorney, stepped forward and handed a thick stack of legally binding injunctions to the terrified board members sitting in the front row. Gregory, the chief financial officer, stared at the documents and buried his face in his hands, recognizing the federal seals stamped across the front pages. "There is not going to be a vote today, Harrison," I announced, my voice clear and carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "And I am not a minority shareholder." Harrison gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning completely white. "We just issued the new Class A voting shares," he fired back, desperation seeping into every single word. "We hold the absolute majority. You lost." I looked at Thomas. He stepped over to the audio-visual console and plugged a secure drive into the main terminal. The massive digital screen behind Harrison flickered. The heavily doctored capitalization table that Harrison had proudly displayed was instantly wiped away. In its place, a massive, intricate financial ownership tree appeared on the glowing screen. It was a web of holding companies, offshore accounts, and banking structures. "Let us talk about those new voting shares, Harrison Hun," I said, turning to face the bewildered board of directors. "Yesterday, your chief executive officer realized he was losing control of his upcoming merger. So he decided to commit massive federal securities fraud. He authorized a $5 million bribe to his chief financial officer to illegally issue those phantom Class A shares." A collective gasp ripped through the boardroom. Several investors aggressively turned toward Gregory, who was actively hyperventilating in his leather chair. Harrison's face turned the color of wet ash. "That is a lie," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You have absolutely no proof of that." I ignored his outburst and gestured toward the massive screen. To fund the bribe and purchase those illegal shares, Harrison took out a highly toxic $50 million mezzanine loan from an anonymous offshore shell company, I explained calmly. He leveraged his luxury penthouse, his investment portfolios, and every single one of his original founder shares as collateral. I pulled a laser pointer from my pocket and directed the red dot at the bottom of the financial tree, illuminating the name of the offshore shell company. Then I traced the red dot upward, following the flow of capital through two intermediary banks, and finally landing on the Apex Parent Corporation at the very top of the chart. The name of my private equity fund flashed in bright red letters. "The offshore shell company that holds your massive unregulated debt is a wholly owned subsidiary of my firm," I stated, watching the absolute horror wash over his face. "I am your shadow lender, Harrison. I am your sole creditor. You came crawling to me for the rope and I gladly handed it to you." The boardroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. The major investors stared at the screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer scale of the financial trap that had just snapped shut in front of them. "You defaulted on your loan at exactly 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon," I continued, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. "You breached the stability covenant when federal agents raided your mother and froze your corporate accounts. Because you defaulted, every single asset you pledged as collateral was immediately legally seized by my holding company." Harrison stumbled backward away from the podium. He bumped into the digital screen looking like a man who had just been shot. "You do not own the Class A shares, Harrison," I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. You do not own your original founder shares. You do not own your luxury real estate or your bank accounts. All of your collateral now legally belongs to me. You do not have the voting power to expel me from this board, because as of yesterday afternoon, I own 100% of your entire life. The silence in the boardroom was finally broken by a harsh, frantic laugh. Harrison backed away from the massive digital screen, shaking his head violently, as if trying to physically dislodge the truth. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. "This is completely illegal," he screamed, his voice cracking loudly over the microphone. "You cannot just buy my debt secretly. That is a massive conflict of interest. You are my wife, not a corporate raider. I will have the Federal Trade Commission investigate your entire fund. I will have you arrested for insider trading before this meeting is adjourned." Thomas, my lead litigation attorney, did not flinch at the empty threats. He adjusted his expensive glasses and looked at Harrison with profound professional pity. "There is absolutely no conflict of interest," Harrison Thomas stated, his voice carrying the calm, heavy weight of absolute legal certainty. "The offshore holding company is a distinctly registered independent legal entity. They purchased your mezzanine debt on the open shadow market legally, transparently, and completely within the bounds of federal finance regulations. You willingly signed a highly leveraged contract with an anonymous lender. You borrowed the money, you breached the stability covenant, and you forfeited your collateral. It is a clean transaction." Harrison gripped his hair, pulling at the roots as his carefully constructed reality violently collapsed around him. He looked out at his board members, desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. But the investors were staring back at him with absolute disgust. They were looking at a man who had not only committed massive federal securities fraud to save his own ego, but had also been outsmarted and bankrupted by his own spouse. Suddenly, a dangerous, manic light sparked in Harrison's bloodshot eyes. His narcissism, desperately searching for a lifeline, found a new angle of attack. He stopped pulling his hair and stood up straight, smoothing the wrinkled lapels of his expensive suit. "Fine," Harrison spat, stepping away from the podium and walking toward the center of the table. "You want to play hardball. You are right, Thomas. She is my wife. We are legally married in the state of New York. And because we are married, we share our financial burdens and our financial victories." Harrison slammed both of his hands onto the polished wood, leaning toward me. He thought he had just discovered the ultimate checkmate. "If you own that private equity fund, then I own half of it," Harrison declared, his voice echoing with renewed, arrogant confidence. "Everything you built during our marriage is a marital asset. You hid $400 million from me. You operated a massive financial empire in secret. In a divorce court, every single asset your trust controls and every single company you own is subject to a 50-50 split." He started pacing back and forth along the length of the table, completely ignoring the shocked expressions of his board members. He was actively attempting to extort me in front of 30 witnesses. "You think you took my company?" Harrison laughed, a bitter, triumphant sound. "You just handed me the keys to your entire empire. I am going to file for divorce this afternoon. I am going to petition the family court to freeze your private equity fund. I will drag you through years of public litigation. You are going to have to cut me a check for $200 million just to make me go away." He crossed his arms, looking down at me with a sickeningly smug expression. He actually believed he had won. He firmly believed his status as a husband entitled him to raid my personal wealth. He thought the law was a weapon designed exclusively for his benefit. "So go ahead, Natalie." Harrison taunted, his voice dripping with venom. "Take the Class A shares. Take my penthouse. I do not care anymore. Because I am walking out of this marriage with half of your entire net worth." I let his words hang in the silent boardroom. I looked at the flushed, arrogant face of a man who still believed he was the smartest person in the room. I did not look angry or intimidated. "Are you quite finished, Harrison?" I asked softly. He sneered, leaning closer. "Did you forget about family law?" "No. I replied calmly, opening the brass clasps of my sleek leather briefcase. I have an excellent grasp of family law. But it appears you have completely forgotten about contract law. I reached into the dark interior of the briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound document printed on heavy, crisp parchment paper. I placed it squarely on the solid table right in front of him. It was the original physical copy of our prenuptial agreement. Harrison stared at the thick document sitting on the boardroom table. It was the exact same stack of papers he had so proudly thrown onto my dinner plate at the Hamptons' engagement party. He scoffed, looking at it as if it were a completely useless prop. That document was drafted by my lawyers to protect my startup, he mocked, though his voice was rapidly losing its sharp edge. It does not mean anything now that the company shares have been seized. It certainly does not protect a massive corporate holding fund you deliberately hid from me. I did not touch the document. I simply gestured toward Thomas. My lead litigation attorney stepped forward, opened the heavy parchment cover, and flipped directly to the final page. It protects exactly what the text dictates. Harrison Thomas said, his voice projecting effortlessly across the silent room. You demanded absolute financial separation. You wanted an ironclad wall to ensure your wife could never touch your equity. But when Natalie had us insert a single addendum before signing, she made that legal wall completely symmetrical. Thomas cleared his throat and read the clause aloud, the words echoing off the glass walls. Total waiver of rights to any assets derived from the blind trusts of either party. No marital claim shall be recognized against any holding company, private equity fund, or corporate entity owned anonymously or otherwise by either spouse prior to or during the marriage. Harrison's face went completely blank. The investors in the room shifted in their seats, realizing the absolute perfection of the legal trap. You mocked her for that clause, Thomas continued, closing the document with a heavy thud. You laughed and asked if she had a blind trust for neighborhood bake sales. You signed it without a second thought. Because of the prenuptial agreement that you demanded, you have absolutely zero legal claim to her private equity firm, her holding companies, or the offshore shell corporation that currently owns your defaulted debt. You get nothing. Harrison backed away from the table, his chest heaving. The realization that he could not extort me for half of my empire finally broke the last remaining piece of his arrogant facade. But he was a cornered animal, and he aggressively grabbed for the absolute last lifeline available to a failing executive. Fine. Harrison practically spat, his voice trembling with a volatile mixture of rage and absolute defeat. You own the shares. You own my debt. But I am still the founder and the chief executive officer of this company. My employment contract is incredibly specific. If you want me out, you have to terminate me without cause. That triggers my executive severance package. You are legally obligated to pay me a $50 million golden parachute just to make me walk out that door. I am not leaving here empty-handed. I smiled. It was the same warm, genuine smile I had given him in my hotel suite yesterday afternoon. I completely agree, Harrison, I said, walking slowly around the large mahogany table toward the podium. An executive of your stature definitely deserves exactly what his contract stipulates. But you seem to have a terrible habit of signing legally binding documents without reading them. I reached into my tailored jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the signature page from the sleek black folder he had blindly signed in my hotel suite while frantically trying to secure the spousal consent for his white knight investor. Yesterday, you were absolutely terrified of going to federal prison, I reminded him, holding the paper up for the board of directors to see. You were so desperate for my signature that you willingly signed a mutual release regarding your executive compensation. I told you it was just standard business protocol. Harrison's eyes widened in sheer panic. He remembered the black folder. He remembered scribbling his name as fast as he could to beat the shadow lender deadline. This document, I stated, my voice echoing with finality, is a total and unconditional surrender of your chief executive severance package. You legally waived your right to the golden parachute. You waived your right to any future compensation, stock options, or buyout premiums. You signed away your only safety net because you were too panicked to read the fine print. Harrison tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He looked out at the board members, the people he had commanded and manipulated for years. None of them looked back. They were staring at me, the new absolute owner of their company. I stepped right up to the podium, standing inches away from the man who had spent 2 years trying to make me feel small. I looked directly into his panicked, defeated eyes. "You do not have a company," I told him quietly, so only he could hear the absolute venom in my voice. "You do not have a severance package. You do not have a marriage, and you do not have a single dollar of my money." I turned to face the silent room, taking my rightful place at the head of the table. As the sole controlling shareholder of this corporation, I announced clearly, I am officially terminating Harrison from his position as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately for gross financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Security will escort you out of the building. 2 towering security guards stepped forward, immediately boxing him in. Harrison did not put up a fight or yell any further threats. The sheer weight of his complete and total financial ruin had finally crushed whatever fight he had left in him. He walked out of the massive glass-walled boardroom in complete, defeated silence. 30 minutes later, I stood on the upper mezzanine, looking down at the main lobby. I watched as the former chief executive officer of a $300 million tech startup was escorted out of his own building. He was carrying a single small cardboard box containing a few pathetic personal desk items, a framed photo of himself, and a cheap coffee mug. His highly tailored designer suit suddenly looked entirely too large for his deflated, slumping frame. The employees he had aggressively bullied and belittled for years stopped their work and watched him leave with absolutely zero sympathy. He walked out through the heavy revolving doors onto the busy Manhattan street and simply disappeared into the anonymous crowd. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. His family fared no better in the aftermath. With the corporate accounts permanently frozen and all their assets seized by the federal government, Beatrice and Caroline experienced a brutal, devastating crash into reality. I received a highly comprehensive report from my private investigators a few weeks later detailing their new lives. Because Beatrice was facing massive federal indictments for corporate embezzlement and tax evasion, her remaining high society friends completely abandoned her overnight. Nobody wanted to be associated with a highly publicized federal tax fraud case. Beatrice and Caroline were forcefully evicted and had to move out of their affluent, manicured suburb. They relocated into a cramped, incredibly cheap 2-bedroom apartment in a decaying, noisy building on the far outskirts of the city. Caroline, who had spent her entire adult life aggressively swiping her brother credit cards for luxury designer handbags, was forced to take a grueling minimum wage job as a cashier at a local grocery store just to keep their electricity turned on. Beatrice spent her days sitting in their dingy living room, staring at peeling wallpaper, waiting for her criminal trial to begin. She was completely stripped of the legacy and the wealth she had constantly weaponized against me. There was, however, one person from that deeply toxic family who walked away completely unscathed and incredibly successful. Derek, the brilliant African-American forensic accountant who had been mocked and marginalized by them for years, found himself in incredibly high demand. Once the news of his meticulous audit and his absolute ethical integrity leaked into the New York financial sector, every major firm in the city wanted him on their roster. He quickly accepted a highly lucrative senior partner position at one of the top-tier forensic accounting agencies in Manhattan. He finalized his divorce from Caroline quickly and cleanly, cutting all ties. The last I heard, he had purchased a beautiful historic brownstone in Brooklyn and was thriving both professionally and personally. He had correctly identified a sinking ship and possessed the sharp intelligence to walk away before it dragged him under. As for me, the aftermath was swift and incredibly profitable. The divorce proceedings were undeniably the easiest my legal team had ever handled in their entire careers. Harrison had absolutely no money to hire a defense attorney, and because of the strict prenuptial agreement he had forced me to sign, he had zero legal standing to claim a single penny of my private equity empire. The family court judge finalized the dissolution of our marriage in absolute record time. With Harrison completely removed from the equation, I successfully merged his tech startup directly into my primary holding fund. I immediately fired the slimy chief financial officer Gregory, who was subsequently indicted by the federal government alongside Beatrice, and installed a highly competent, loyal executive team. The software company flourished under my direct aggressive control, tripling its market valuation within the first 6 months. It was a crisp Friday evening when the final acquisition paperwork was officially filed and sealed. I stood alone in my sleek, glass-enclosed command center, looking out over the fading daylight. I picked up the original physical copy of the prenuptial agreement from my desk. The heavy parchment paper that Harrison had proudly thrown onto my dinner plate at the Hamptons' engagement party felt incredibly light and flimsy in my hands. I walked over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder sitting in the corner of my office. I turned the machine on and slowly fed the 50-page document into the grinding metal teeth. I watched the legally binding contract that was meant to keep me poor and subservient turn into thousands of tiny, meaningless ribbons of white paper. I turned off the shredder, picked up my designer cashmere coat, and walked out of the office. The private elevator took me down to the secure underground garage, where my personal driver was waiting, holding the door open to a sleek black town car. I slid into the luxurious leather back seat and instructed him to take me home. As the car pulled out onto the busy New York streets, I looked out the tinted window at the glittering electric skyline. The towering skyscrapers were massive monuments to power, leverage, and strategy. I was never a victim. I was never a quiet little wife waiting for a generous allowance. I was a self-made queen who had confidently stepped into a rigged game, flipped the board entirely, and walked away holding every single winning piece. Thank you for listening to my story. Never let anyone dictate your worth, and always remember to read the fine print. The story of Natalie and Harrison serves as a masterclass on one of the most fatal flaws in both business and life: the dangerous arrogance of underestimating others based on superficial metrics. Harrison, blinded by his own narcissism, looked at Natalie and saw only what he wanted to see: a quiet, subservient accessory to his own grand narrative. He equated her modest lifestyle and understated demeanor with weakness, completely failing to recognize the brilliant financial strategist standing right in front of him. This fatal miscalculation is what ultimately built his own downfall. By insisting on a draconian prenuptial agreement to protect his fragile ego and his startup, he unknowingly locked himself out of a $500 million empire. The profound lesson here is that true power rarely needs to announce itself. While Harrison felt the constant need to boast, parade his wealth, and belittle those around him, the truly powerful players were observing, calculating, and moving in absolute silence. Arrogance creates massive blind spots, making people incredibly vulnerable to the very individuals they dismiss. In our own lives, whether negotiating a corporate deal, navigating complex family dynamics, or simply evaluating the people we meet, we must remember that a person's true capability is rarely printed on their business card or displayed through their material possessions. Humility, respect, and meticulous attention to detail, especially when it comes to the fine print, are the actual hallmarks of a successful leader. When we assume we are the smartest person in the room, we are almost always the most vulnerable. Evaluate the relationships in your own life today and ask yourself if you are treating others with the genuine respect their unseen potential deserves.